suddenly you're not dealing with players that are looking for what's next. You're looking for players that are actually pretty happy with sort of their gaming hobby and their ecosystem, and they aren't necessarily looking for the new thing. It's learning the hard way that a lot of those skills are less transferable, like the mindset, leadership style, management techniques, and sort of technology sensibilities that really helped you in your last job are less transferable into your next job as you might think. I think it's just a different animal, and it's impacting the industry indirectly because it represents such a significant amount of player time, investment, but it's this beast that's sort of laughing at us that we're trying to sort of put in a headlock.
How have changes in the games industry caught studios off guard? Are movies and music really a good comparison for games when it comes to thinking about product? What's a leader's role when it comes to playtesting? Today we're talking with Leif Johansson. Leif is a design and game director and now studio founder who has been working on competitive multiplayer shooters for a very long time. He got his start in Call of Duty before working for a time on Destiny and is now starting his own still in stealth mode project. Leif is a systems thinker. And he's got some serious insight to share about the changes our industry is undergoing, as well as some tips for making new games. Leif, it's great to talk to you, but I want to give you an opportunity to just introduce yourself real quick. Who is Leif? What's your background? Where'd you come from?
Yeah, I'm fundamentally a competitive multiplayer systems designer that specializes in shooters. I'm good at other things. I've learned other muscles, but I've spent my career working almost exclusively on competitive shooters, and I tend to get thrown at the most academic, non-iterative, too many moving parts and problems earlier in my career. And that's definitely informed my more recent learnings. I've spent the last 7 years building teams from scratch, building IPs from scratch, in either a design director role or a full-on sort of project lead role. So I'm slowly growing producer muscles, but I very much consider myself a designer, but I think team building and theory is definitely where I'm spending way more time, enough that sort of what used to be my design cycles thinking about the player experience, I've been spending more cycles thinking about, what should this role even be and when do you hire it? And do you hire, who might succeed in that role?
What are you excited? What games have you been playing? What games are you excited about that are upcoming?
So I gave you my list recently of my games I'm looking for this year: Slay the Spire 2, Grand Theft Auto, Night Rain. But I've just been playing lots of Marvel Rivals and Helldivers 2. Helldivers 2 is my game of the year in 2020. Every time I go back to it, it just puts a smile on my face. It's so good. Marvel Rivals just massively overperformed my expectations. I was oh, it's going to be pretty good, but we'll see if it's got legs. And the more
I'll be honest, I predicted it to die. I was like, this game's dead. I don't think it's going to make it. And now I'm like, well, I was wrong.
It's just, there's just little buried things inside those kits. There's just these little gems. I was figuring out Thor last night, and I'm like, oh, This kit's it's all right. And then I started clicking in my head. I'm like, oh, this is clever. Now I understand how this goes with that. So it's just, I think for a lot of these games, they'll give you a toy and it feels, flavorful and fun, but then you start solving problems with it and you're like, oh man, actually this is pretty clever. Yeah.
Oh man, I almost want to just dive into Marvel Rivals, but I won't do that. I play Captain America and I just run in and die most of the time.
Buffed him. He just got buffed in the patch. So.
Oh yes. Okay, I'm hopping back in. All right. So speaking of state of game dev, what do you see out there in our industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's really easy to sort of run into a rabbit hole, but I think we're in a pretty big shift. I think we sort of spent more than a couple of years just increasing budgets, increasing scale, increasing scope, and getting sort of more complex technology. And I think we finally hit that wall where we're back to asking sort of is this better? Is this working? And if you look at sort of the Game of the Year awards, you really, I think it was pretty stark that some of the best games were from newer, smaller teams, and sort of there isn't this sort of pattern that we were seeing before, where I think there was a a story a couple of years back, which is about basically like double A's dying. It's basically there's indies and there's triple A's, and now I feel like we're kind of shifting back where people are, really looking both as developers and as players. We're like, actually, double A is kind of awesome. Maybe we should go back. But the fundamental reasons why are running into some of the limitations that we run that you talk about on the show, as far as what makes project management scale hard, what makes sort of keeping a game relevant after X years hard. That we know there's just problems that occurred at AAA that I feel like have sort of surprised a lot of people, where teams like that used to be very prestigious are suddenly like not delivering like they used to, and there's this question of sort of like, is it scale itself that's the trouble? Is it sort of the mindset we bring to scale? Like, and I think we're all kind of scrambling for answers. I'm getting pinged by my buddies with sort of philosophical questions at a much higher rate than I would expect, and I'm sort of, it's a bit sad in some ways, but it's also, I think, healthy that we're looking and sort of thinking like, hey, does this really work? Why do we do this? Is this what we want game development to look like? Is this what it needs to look like? I think the biggest change that people kind of slept on and sort of snuck up on everybody is the consequences of big games getting stickier over time, both in mobile and in sort of console and PC. I think we underestimated the consequences of people spending more time in fewer older games. And that sort of reached a critical mass where suddenly, if you're a player and you have a lot of games to play, the likelihood that you are playing your older favorite game is increased just enough that suddenly new games are fighting over scraps, as far as player time. And that was sort of a surprise. I think people were kind of shocked that how much that sort of changed sort of how you compete, how you build something, how you market. On top of that, it's just raised the bar. I think it's more fresh in people's heads how much fun they have playing their favorite older game. And that's raising expectations of sort of how interesting or how high quality a new game needs to be. And people are just getting more sophisticated as to sort of how they spend their time. So it's like, I think, healthy in the sense that if you're making a game, you have to sort of think that much more critically about what makes it special and sort of what it means to people. But it's also sort of thinking about how those player habits might sort of change how you make your game. Because you do this, I do this, where sort of suddenly there's a minor update to your old favorite game. That's the competition as a new game you have. It's sort of like small change in old game versus your entire project happening sort of, some similar period of time. And I think we're still digesting it. I think we're seeing the consequences broadly, but we're still sort of doing the detective work to figure out like, well, wait a minute, or is the way people consume games really changed that much? It's like, yeah, right underneath our feet, it's been changing.
Yeah. I liked how you described it too. It's almost, okay, I haven't actually read the book, but Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point.
Yeah.
And it feels like it has that type of vibe to it, where underneath everything else, there was this more and more time was being spent on older and older projects, or products, games. And suddenly we reach this point where, wait a minute, any new game now is not going into a space where it only has to compete with the other new games. It has to compete with every good game from the last 20 years. And that's like, what? I see you look at Counter-Strike numbers over time on Steam, and it's just like, it's close to the biggest it's ever been. And you're like, wait a minute, what in the world's, like, what is going on? It's such a weird world to live in. And it was just subtle. And I think a lot of it did happen over the last 5 or 10 years, because that was really when, you had some MMOs before that, like you had Counter-Strike before that, but that was really when you started seeing some of these live services just put a lot of money and effort. Maybe 15 years is a better frame for that, 10, 15 years, where you just started seeing a lot of effort going into how do I sustain this over a long period of time?
Yeah, it's really interesting because most entertainment businesses like, television, music, film, books, like you engage with a thing, you finish it, and then you move on to the next one. And that paradigm has like informed a tremendous amount of sort of video game thinking from product strategy to project management. And it's in some ways it's good, like, out the old, what's new. And the game industry has slowly drifted back towards traditional market dynamics where you have bigger, more establishing players that aren't sort of letting go anymore. And the way you compete in an area where there's big established players that aren't letting go is closer to how Coke competes with Pepsi as opposed to how Wicked competes as a film. So it's like, depending on sort of what genre you're competing in, it might fundamentally change how much thought you put into how you compete and sort of how do you prove yourself you're ready to compete, and sort of thinking about what players actually want and what makes them happy. Like, I think, I don't think that gets in the way of sort of it being an art form and being creative. It's just different because suddenly you're not dealing with players that are looking for what's next. You're looking for players that are actually pretty happy with sort of their gaming hobby and their ecosystem, and they aren't necessarily looking for the new thing. And if it's new, the likelihood that they check you out and go back to their favorite thing, that you're sort of they're a tourist in your game, but they're sort of an enthusiast in their game, like, that's much more serious. And I think that used to be on the fringes, and at some point, like you were saying, there was a tipping point where sort of the broader video game medium started drifting in that direction. And I think a lot of the publishers and devs are scrambling to figure out sort of what to do and how to sort of adjust. And I think it's, like, we're seeing it in front of us. And in a lot of ways, we assumed that the next big hobby game had similar economics to the last big hobby game. And some publishers, ran into a wall realizing, like, no, those players weren't looking for the next big hobby game. They're still playing the last one, man. And it's like, oh, okay. Yeah. Well, now what is that? Hold on a second. We have to think about this. It's like, yeah, man, I don't know either, but we do need to think about this.
Yeah. A couple of things came to mind. One is chess. Chess is this game that's, I don't actually know the full history of it, but it's a very old game. And you can imagine how many games that are in many ways similar to chess were probably attempted over the thousands of years that humans have been making games, tens of thousands of years that we've been making games, and trying to, like, do this. And chess survived. And it's like, why did chess survive? Because it did. Because it was good. Because it engaged people. Because whatever it was. And I think I was reading about it, and it was like the last, rule change that happened around some particular sequence of moves. I'm not a chess guy, but it was there. Since then, it's just been, this is the game, right? And it's played around the world. It's a competitive sport. Why did it survive? Why did everything else not? And there's stuff like Go and checkers and other games that still endure, and you get some really hilarious ones from a game design perspective, like tic-tac-toe and stuff like that are just so simple. They just get pushed down generation to generation without anybody even realizing what's happening. But
I want to plus
there's
one
this,
that
like,
real quick.
There's this depth. Yeah.
Yeah, like cricket is massive in India. And why not in America? Rugby in South Africa. And you're like, oh, that's because of history and culture. And it's like, yeah, but it's still weird that, like, what's a beloved national sport in one area is culturally irrelevant on another. And it's the same thing with, like, music genres. Like, what makes a music genre more evergreen versus not? And it's just, when these things are sticky and they're established, and you're like, hey, Gen Z's into basketball but less into baseball, and you're trying to understand why. And it's like, do we need to change baseball to make it more appealing to Gen? Like, those questions are fundamentally different than the traditional questions we've had with games, because we haven't had to wrestle with the fact that these things have legs and permanence and cultural significance in ways that are really hard to understand, but totally change how smart it is or is not to spend on a video game. Like, if you're trying to, if you're trying to build like a hobby game, and you're like, well, are we the next World of Warcraft or not? That is a much harder conversation than the film equivalent of sort of, are we the next big action adventure game for 2020, whatever. That sort of, the strategy and the moving parts are much more complicated because you're sort of operating in a different space. But we call both these things video games, and that's, I think, what makes it easy to sort of make the mistake of assuming, like, trying to make a great one of these is similar to trying to make a great one of these other ones. Like, they're different
Well, it's
creatures.
the thing that just struck me again, coming back to other mediums, is hey, game development, you have to see yourself from a virality perspective more like tag and capture the flag played on like a field with a bunch of kids running around than like Dune 2.
Yeah.
Like you are in some way, yes, in some ways you're like Dune 2, but in a lot of ways you're like tag.
Depending on your
Because
genre, some genres in the middle,
depending on your genre,
some
yes,
of them
exactly.
like
And interestingly, it pushes something that I think. So let's say 15 years. I mean, you can go back to again Counter-Strike, but let's say World of Warcraft 20 years ago launches, and there were MMOs before that, but that really just put the flag on as like, okay, this thing is running and it's running for a long time. Um, and it took a while, right? You had League of Legends come out 2009, but it took like a while before people kind of caught up in terms of their development efforts of what does it mean to make a live service product, because you didn't have as many that were trying to do that. We could be a multi-decade or multi-generational product. Um, and then when they did, they were like, wait a minute, could I spend $100 million and make $1 billion a year? Well, that seems like a good deal. And so you had this like jump in investment, and suddenly everybody was trying to make a live service game. And the interesting thing is when you look at a lot of the big hits over the last few years, they've been either open world RPGs or, like Baldur's Gate, like stuff where you play it, you enjoy it, you go through the experience. Like I have no doubt, Witcher 4 is going to be a good game. I'm looking like that's one I'm excited about. It's going to be solid. Like, and yet it's not going to probably, I mean, I don't know what they actually may.
it's unlikely it turns into an entire hobby ecosystem.
Exactly. You're going to play it. You're going to love it. You're going to enjoy it. And then you're going to move on.
Yeah.
And they designed it that way. They built it that way. And you can go back and play it again. And like, if you really like it, like I played Baldur's Gate 3 a couple of times through and I enjoyed each run. But I didn't like at this point, it might be a couple years before I go back in, unless if my friend group is all like, let's do another BG3 run. Maybe I'll hop in. But it's this thing of, I feel like those games actually occupy the space you're talking about because they do, like you said, based on genre, they sit in that space of being, I don't need to be an evergreen product. I can just be the game that you are the tourist in. And then you can go back and live in World of Tanks if you want to.
Yeah, it's just another album that people can enjoy and go through. And so I'm going to say something, but it's going to give you an emotional reaction. And I want you to hold on to that emotional reaction. Okay, you're an investor. And I'm like, what's really big in India? Cricket. I'm going to invent a new sport and take it to India. And it's going to be just as culturally relevant and as exciting and as good as cricket. But we'll still make money even if it's like half as good. And you're like, if you're an investor, I feel like there's a flavor there that's basically like, man, like I kind of want to just give you a hug because like, dude, no, come on, no. And it's like, but it would make so much money, and it's just like, yeah, but like you're predicting that your band Nirvana is going to like reinvent music. It could happen, but it might also be some obscure niche thing that sort of like lives and dies.
Yeah.
But like, so it's just you when you're making these bets as a publisher or as a developer, like. There is this tension between like, yeah, this might be the next thing and it might be like ludicrously huge and we need to be prepared to support it. But really like to try to do that reliably or to sort of build a business case from that scenario backwards is just so tremendously hard. And like I think I'm privileged because I've seen it twice. Like I was on Black Ops 1, I was on Destiny 1, like it took off and, picked up a life of its own and sort of went and sort of became this thing that we didn't understand. And in the moment, you feel like, that's right, we did it. We built something great, and now everyone's talking about how it's this like, cultural thing. It's turning it. It's got legs beyond sort of your intention. But in reality, it's pretty rare that even the developers working on the thing itself really fully grasp what got it there, what were the components, what gave it this actual cultural relevance. Like I've had people come up to me and say like, oh, you worked on the game that was my childhood. Like me and my middle school friends like did that every Friday. And I think it's the same thing with I'm not a musician, but if you're a musician working on an album, it's kind of hard to predict the one that's going to have all this weight and significance beyond your intention. And you sort of need to be prepared for it to be just another album. But on the flip side, if that were to happen, you also can't get caught out where suddenly you don't have the progression or pipeline or sort of like, I mean, stuff that happened at Riot where you're like, okay, now that this thing took off, you know, what do we do with it? Like, I think
How do we scale
it's
this?
just a different animal, and it's sort of it's impacting the industry indirectly because it represents such a significant amount of player time, investment. But it's this beast that's sort of laughing at us that we're trying to sort of put in a headlock. You're like, dude, you're trying to make the next cultural touchstone thing. Yes, that would be tremendously lucrative, but you're literally building your business case and your staffing plan thinking that you can do it. Good luck. Hope you're right.
Yeah. Well, I think of the first Overwatch, which I think was a great game. It wasn't my style, but like I know that game like did really well, was really well put together. Very much appreciated it being on the market, kind of what it did and impact it had. In a fairly short space of time, most of the players even stepped away from something like that, a dedicated live service experience that was considered incredibly high quality. It's something where I'm looking at Marvel Rivals and I'm going like, dang, you've outperformed. They have totally outperformed my expectations. I thought it was going to do like, oh, big spike, you know, known IP, whatever, game seems fine. Let's see how it, but it's actually held. It's held and people are still playing it. And I see more and more people playing it over time rather than less and less, which is what I expected. And I'm going like, I wonder how long is this going to run? Are you going to be kind of like a PUBG where you sort of start going up and then come back down? Or are you going to be, you know, something where you already had your spike, but now you're going to stay flat and just kind of hold that for a really long time? And some of that depends on what the development studio does, and some of it depends on what all the other development studios do and what the players ultimately choose. But it puts you in this interesting spot because I do look at Overwatch and go, and within a couple of years, it wasn't as relevant anymore. And that's okay. And again, I think Blizzard was fine with it. Like they'd sold the game, they'd made like a ton of money, given tons and like hundreds and thousands and millions of hours of fun to a lot of players out there, which is great. But it didn't become a game that it didn't stick in the same way that WoW did, or EVE Online did, or Warframe did, which is interesting.
I agree. The other thing that's really changing in the industry, which is subtle, is like in pursuit of these larger games, or you know, the fact that a lot of us came up on franchise games, like the skills and mindsets and you know sensibilities that you grow working on scaled franchises or live games, like can help or hurt you when you're off sort of building something new or are off at a new genre or a new job. Yes. And the tech we build, the tools we use, like I think, you know, not that many years ago, you know, the game industry, when teams were smaller, there was more generalists, you know, there was, you know, in some ways the technology was less complex, workflows were less complex, and that we're at a state where basically people had to become more specialized as managers, as leaders, as craft specialists. And it's learning the hard way that a lot of those skills are less transferable, like the mindset, leadership style, management techniques, and sort of technology sensibilities that really helped you in your last job are less transferable to your next job as you might think. And it's sort of a barrier that's, as we sort of mature as an industry, in some ways, devs are becoming more specialized as to sort of where they grew up and that specific tool set, that specific mindset. And it's, I think as an industry is where we're coming to terms with sort of like people want to be working on new things. They want to be they want to be migrating and sort of, you know, shifting things up, but it's so hard when you're sort of fighting against sort of like you're having to do significant unlearning. That includes me. I think, you know, transitioning between ecosystems.
No, same here.
Like it's funny how often sort of like the habit that you take for granted, or the workflow that you are sort of precious about, is the barrier of you sort of like succeeding in your next job or building that new project. And a lot of the stuff we're talking about on how different live services versus not, or sort of like genres are or not, that sort of as it gets trickier to sort of manage what these, you know, these new types of games, at least what they are fundamentally, it puts us more on the squeeze to sort of be less specialized and be more adaptive in ways that can really hurt. And a lot of the spots where I've spent time like mentoring people on their projects, it's the whiplash of sort of adapting to their new hand of cards, their new circumstance. It's like, like giving people
Yeah.
speeches on like, yes, you need to be in engine more, or no, you need to be in engine less. Why are you spending so much time in engine? Like that's not
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
doesn't make
Yeah.
sense for that new job, that new place. And we don't this like we're making this up go as we go along. There's no sort of like university or academic wing of game development that's sort of like helping prepare us for like, no, that other job is fundamentally more different than any job you've ever had in ways that are difficult to articulate, and your own strengths will suddenly become your own weaknesses. Like for example, like middle management in video game development is like a fast moving target where on sort of large scale franchise teams, they're relearning stuff that's sort of like management fundamentals from other industries from many years ago. We just didn't need them because the industry was never scaled in a position where we needed people to think that way. But on the flip, like a lot of the you know skills that we're sort of applying to sort of this more emergent stuff requires us sort of going back to sort of a different set of fundamentals that are very different from traditional business management stuff. Like it's you actually have to sort of like throw out the book instead of hug the book, and that I think it just creates a lot of sort of chaos and discomfort as to people try to sort of find out where they fit within the industry and sort of what a good development team even is. Like if you were to describe it, sort of what does it look like? And it's like, yeah, man, it's moving pretty quick.
Yeah.
The only thing let me add one more thing before I forget. Like,
Oh yeah.
Like I take playtesting like as serious as anything in all of game development. It's like it's the closest thing that I have like an ideological feelings about. And even if people don't playtest the way I playtest, I do think for an early phase team, like it is worth your time, your mind space. Like people were shocked how often I made time to follow up one-on-one on people's playtest notes to try to understand what they were trying to say better. Like the legwork it takes to sort of really get your playtest ecosystem strong. The fact that people see the most senior roles basically that engaged with what people think, what people have to say, how we format it, how often we do it, like what's in the playtest. Like I've like I think it's sort of like if the playtesting is really good, you could do so many things wrong. You can break so many things. You can make so many mistakes, and like good playtesting will save your team's bacon on multiple occasions. On the flip, if your playtesting's bad, I am like, man, I'm so scared.
Yeah. Well, Ed, I love what you said too about the seeing the senior leaders engaged, because if I didn't back then, but there was a time I was in a studio and they said all the things you're supposed to say about playtesting. Yeah, we're really big on playtesting. Yeah, we're really big on play. Like, oh yeah, we playtest all the time. We play all the time. Except that what they meant was there's a scheduled time, and everybody in the organization below a certain rank basically was told that they needed to go playtest together. But all of the people above, and whether it was middle management or like senior leadership or whatever, there was a line that was drawn, and we don't expect anybody above this line to be playtested because they all have more important things to do. And back then I just thought that was interesting. I was like, I don't know if this is setting this what you want. And what do you know, in not too long a period of time, the whole playtesting system broke down.
I think it happens a lot.
Because there's a cultural cascade thing. There's a behavioral cascade that happens there where if you'd done the other thing, if you'd had your leaders all the way up say, no, playtesting is really important, and so I'm in it with you, I make time for it. Yeah, sometimes I'm traveling because I'm a CEO and I need to go to DICE or I need to go to Europe to go to DreamHack or something like that. But when I'm here, I'm playtesting with everybody else, and I'm taking it seriously, and I'm filling out my feedback form or whatever it is, right? Putting some notes in. It transmits something to the team, and it does teach them that, okay, this is important. And not only that, but it does mean that, because the opposite thing that I see that gets teams in big trouble is, one, you break down the playtest because none of the leaders above, like, let's say middle management and up, none of them actually do it because they're all too busy. And what that means is that when the senior leaders, who are actually the key stakeholders, who choose whether this thing gets funded or not, they only interact with the game every so often in very special playtests, and every time they're surprised.
Yep.
because they're not actually in tune with the product on a regular basis. And so they see it and they're like, wait a minute. And now they've got a ton of notes and you're trying to like disentangle all those notes from this stuff. Well, yeah, we've been doing this for 3 months. It's like, well, sorry, I haven't had time to, you haven't you haven't prioritized. You haven't prioritized being in that room with the game in an internal sense. And so, yeah, just I'm doubling down on what you're saying, I guess.
It's funny because some people are really scared to have senior leaders in playtests because it's like, it'd be insufficiently presentable. What if there's a bug? And I'm like, they need to, eat the pizza we're cooking along with everybody else so they understand the rate of change. Like you said, that they're literate in sort of the ups and downs, that their expectations are managed. Like if they're choking on your playtest, it's worth your time to sort of go handhold, educate, soft skill it up and manage up and try to get them to understand, we're not spending this is intentionally ugly, or we're not going to spend money on this feature. Like get them in the boat to understand how you're approaching the problem, and it'll pay massive dividends well beyond the next milestone, because they're going to feel like, you were working the problem together and you cared about their take. Like it also sort of like, a lot of execs, sometimes you put a build in front of them, they feel like it's their job to sort of give like profound notes and be highly literate because it's a high stakes decision. And like often sort of if they're nitpicking the wrong things and they're sort of like a little scattered, a lot of it's because they're trying to save face and be polite, and they understand, oh man, I have been busy, I didn't make time to sort of play your bit. Like they're humans too, and you might be quietly doing a favor by sort of feeding them reps. I also feel like some of the best playtest notes I've gotten are for people that on other teams or other disciplines that like intermittently play the build. And often, I've had lawyers and marketers and IT people sort of like that context, knowing the state of your game, knowing the state of your team, knowing who you are by name, pays dividends in other ways. It's like, like if they're a fan of your game, like you are going to sort of like, like the thing that you want is the IT person telling the CEO, like, hey man, I really love that game. Like, I play these games and I love it. Like you get buy-in in other ways. And then last bit, it's often sort of the place where people that might be pulled away to work on theoretical problems, pulled away to work on novel problems, suddenly have a change of mind when they see a real human trying to sort of solve a playtest problem, like, or they hear it all around the room, man, we got this bad bug. Some engineer's like, oh, that thing that's been in my queue, like it's 10 deep in my priority. You know what? I'm going to knock that thing out. You get much more organic velocity when people have that, like when they want to protect it, when it feels like it's something that they can help make better. Like all the more reason, like even if the notes are for any reason not productive, just from sheer team building and sort of shared context, shared purpose, like it's the closest thing I have to secret sauce is good playtesting.
Please don't try to replace playtesting.
Yeah. It's also like people often see that as very audience centric and like miss the window that it's like, no, it's also you and your team together.
Yeah. It's part of building your lab.
Yeah.
We interact with the stuff that we produce, and we are comfortable having other people interact with it. And this has been awesome. So I want to give you an opportunity, Leif, anything you want to plug before we wrap?
A plug? I did start a new game company, but it's secret. So I'll soft plug it. I am.
There you go.
Yeah. I've been posting on LinkedIn a little more if people want to follow me. I've been trying to sort of.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Folks should check it out. So we'll make sure to put your LinkedIn in the show notes. Anything else?
No, that's all. I just I really love your show because I like that you're thinking critically, not just about sort of game production, but how we make games, how we approach it. I think it's healthy. It's on my rotation. Like I'm just like when there's a new episode, like it's like always top of my list. So no, I'll plug you. You're my plug. How about that?
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. It means a lot to me. All right. With that, we will wrap it up. So until next time, thanks all for listening. Thank you, Leif, so much for being here and sharing your wisdom with us. That was awesome.
Cool. Thanks, man.
All right, to quickly summarize what I took away from that episode. First, scale is harder than you think, and game dev doesn't have a ton of experience solving the problems that the decades of success and growth have brought to our doorstep. Figuring out scale matters a lot now. 2, more player time spent in older games kind of snuck up on everyone. It means you need to look harder at if you will be able to pull players away from those games, and recognize that any new game competes with an update even from an older beloved game, not just other new products. 3. Games are not like other media and entertainment. There are differences from music or movies or other consumable content. Many games are less like a blockbuster superhero movie and more like chess or tag or cricket. Does that shift how you approach development and think about your game? 4. Some games aren't like sports or tag or chess. Depending on your genre, maybe you are more like that blockbuster superhero movie. Do you know where you are? If not, you should try to figure that out. It'll impact how you think about selling your product. If all your plans are about becoming the next cultural touchstone game, recognize that this lowers your odds of success. You might do it, true, but if it's only all right, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. It's probably better to be ready for a small hit or a massive success if you can pull that off, not just be prepared for the massive success. 6. As game dev grows, specialization has emerged. And this has some weird consequences. Someone with lots of experience in games as a service may struggle creating something new, while someone focused entirely on incubation and prototyping might make terrible mistakes if put in charge of something live service. Be aware of your skills and limitations and be willing to learn if you're in a space you're not familiar with. 7. Similarly, ideas about management and leadership that other industries have wrestled with for a long time are only recently coming to the fore in game dev. And while we can't just copy the standards directly because game dev is a bit unique, we also shouldn't ignore the lessons that other people and organizations have learned the hard way. 8. How leaders relate to internal playtests will have a huge impact on how valuable they are and if they'll even keep going. Great playtesting can save you and can also provide insight that you just can't get any other way early in development. Don't skip it. All right, that wraps us up. Thank you all.